Hello, everyone. I'm concerned about what's happening in our world in many ways, and our lack of what I would call metaphysics, but that's a big word for these days. My name is John Patrick. My prayer, O Lord, give ear to my supplications. In your faithfulness, answer me, and in your righteousness, do not enter into judgment with your servant, for in your sight no one living is righteous. This week, in my reading of the Psalms, I came to Psalm 143. It's the loss of that sense of righteousness and unrighteousness which our world is missing, in my view. A little later on, the psalmist says this: I spread out my hands to you, my soul longs for you like a thirsty land. Answer me speedily, O Lord, my spirit fails. Do not hide your face from me, lest I be like those who go down into the pit. Cause me to hear your loving kindness in the morning. I think it's a lovely phrase, cause me to hear your loving kindness in the morning. Some mornings I don't, but most mornings I do. I only have to sit on my deck and look at the world around and shake off the bad vibes, is what the modern world would call it, but much more likely it's deeper than that. So I just watched the birds and the beauty of the birds. Yesterday morning when I went out on the deck, a little bird, a flycatcher, had obviously knocked itself out, and I picked it up and it wasn't dead. I stroked it a bit and it woke up and looked at me mystified and then flew away. I've got lots of great-grandchildren at the moment, and the more technocratic end of our family have set up in our living room a place where photographs of the family turn up. What children do to adults is wonderful, both male and female, very different. And I've really enjoyed looking at my sons-in-law holding their firstborn over the last few weeks, and they look beautiful. They have been civilized by this little life that has already captured them completely. And there are so many people missing out on that. This last issue of First Things had a piece by Freya India in First Things, and she begins by saying, what I'm doing writing here, I'm not sure. I've come across her on Substack as well, and she's a lost lass. She's longing for things she no longer knows how to name, and for a world that she has not been introduced to. I hope that she gets there. So, beauty is one of the things that we have to acknowledge and start thinking about it. And last week, or no, it's a week more than that, I was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and then later in Chicago. And the home where I was staying, there was a big fat book of C.S. Lewis quotations, and I was just thumbing through and came across one I had forgotten about. It's Lewis talking about how beauty can impact our lives, and he asks you to imagine that you're walking through a wood, and it's a lovely day, and the light is coming through the trees beautifully, and then suddenly one ray of light seems to come down and hit a particular spot and draw your eye to something which is stunningly beautiful. Like in my case, it happens every spring when I see the first blue-eyed grass. You have to pick it or get on your knees to see its exquisite beauty. And Lewis says what you should do then is think about what kind of mind could allow that personal attraction to beauty to happen. What kind of mind, what kind of person would produce that? And that's adoration, I think, in a way that I can understand. Adore used to be a word with a rather more specific meaning. Now it's got, like so many words, muddied up with various misuses. So that's our world. Still places where reality can creep in. People are stopped in their tracks by beautiful things still. And I think we should draw their attention to what's happened to them. Here's my favorite account of this in poetry. It's someone I'm always trying to get you to read, George Herbert. It's called The Pulley. You can get George Herbert's poems in one collected book if you want a little book of poetry, which will always move you on. So this is one of my favorites. When God at first made man, having a glass of blessings standing by, let us, said he, pour on him all we can. Let the world's riches which dispersed lie contract into a span. So strength first made a way, then beauty flowed, then wisdom, honour, pleasure. When almost all was out, God made us stay, perceiving that alone of all his treasure, rest in the bottom lay. For if I should, said he, bestow this jewel also on my creature, he would adore my gifts instead of me, and rest in nature, not the God of nature, so both should losers be. Yet let him keep the rest, but keep them with repining restlessness. Let him be rich and weary, that at least, if goodness lead him not, yet weariness may toss him to my breast. That is so often the case, that people, everything turns to gold except their soul, and then they find the real reason that they're here. And what bothers me about our culture at the moment, in America you still use the term God in elections, but it's almost meaningless. When you think of some of the people who say God bless America, when their lives indicate they have no interest in God whatsoever. In Canada, God was not mentioned in the last election as far as I could see. That's deeply problematic, because without transcendence, without God, without metaphysics, the answers to the big questions are not satisfying. We are deeply troubled because of it. So what do we do? How do we deal with this? We cannot do without transcendence for long. And you in America, who I know probably constitute the majority of people watching this podcast, you have an interesting tradition in this respect. You have what might be called a civil religion, because a good many Americans would call themselves Christian, but it has very little content. But it has given structure to the life of America. Both de Tocqueville and Chesterton, as I'm constantly reiterating, understood this. But so many Americans take it for granted, and it should not be taken for granted because it is not secure. Empires come and go. Yours has been a relatively charitable one, and you have not been thanked very much for that. That's the human condition when there is no God in their thoughts, because instead of being able to say, wow, what's God at work doing here, they're envious. Most of what's going on at the moment is pure envy. The anti-Semitism is pure envy. The Islamic anger is deep, and it's hard to see how they're going to escape it, because they were told by their imams, picking and choosing from the collage of so-called unchangeable literature, that they were they had received the final revelation from God, and they were going to rule the world. Well, they've had 13 centuries, and they don't rule the world. The world wishes they would change the way they are. It has to be faced that at the heart of many problems in the world is the clash between Islam and every other religion, this entitlement syndrome, which is built in from the beginning. The only way we get past that is by coming to terms with truth in a way that it appears the Islamic world is having to do at the moment. Missionaries made no impact, but the internet is certainly getting to young Muslims in a way that's extraordinary. Not tens and dozens, but thousands, tens of thousands, and maybe hundreds of thousands are saying enough. As long as they had no access to the Quran, they didn't read Arabic, not that the Quran was written in Arabic necessarily. That's another discussion. And so they believed what they were taught in the mosque. But once the internet arrived, they could look on the world elsewhere and say, hey, who got left behind? We had a so-called golden age, which was pretty golden for its time, but that was 13 centuries ago almost. Well, let's be a little bit kind, 8 centuries ago. It was a golden age. They did lead the world briefly, but they'd achieved that power not by persuasion, but by the power of the sword and military tactics and strategies and a tremendous drive to conquer. Christians, on the other hand, had conquered the Mediterranean some half dozen centuries before without using the sword, by the nature of the word that they spread, the gospel. And of course, at the heart of that is transcendence. God became man. And that changes everything, because when a God like that spoke, he spoke truth. So the Torah, which the Muslims say is really part of early Islam, that's the way they try and get around it, but it was Jewish. The children of Israel were given a set of rules that defined their lives in a very good way. You could call them, I like to call them, 10 divine intolerances, because that sort of rubs the nose of the liberal elite in what they're trying to do. Thou shalt not. God lays down 10 things that he will not tolerate, and he says if you don't accept that, you will not flourish. But if you do accept it, if you accept those things, you will flourish. It's extraordinary but true that it is legitimate intolerance that defines a society. What we will not tolerate defines us in many ways. So the 10 Commandments defined Jewish society, and the Pharisees and all the rest got to work on it over time, making it into, 613 rules, and they argued about them endlessly and lost sight of the nature of the God who had spoken to them in their own voice, in their own language, in a voice that they understood, accompanied by thunder and lightning and a small volcano, an extraordinary contact with God. Now, they lost their way in Kabbalism for a long while, but once they got their act together, my goodness, they've taken over. Muslims haven't won a hard Nobel Prize, if you exclude politics and sociology as sciences, which I think should be excluded, but in real science, Muslims haven't won a prize in 20 years, whereas the Jews have taken almost 50% of them every year. That's an extraordinary success, given all that has happened to the Jews. And as Tom Sowell says, the only thing the Jews need to do to get the other people off their back is fail. But they're not going to do that. Look at what tiny Israel can do. They write most of the critical software for everything you use. That's the world that we have to deal with. So we need transcendence. We need something above us all that we all recognize. Chesterton put it, America is a country with the soul of a church. You are blessed to be formed in the 18th century. Before railways and roads were available, there you were sitting at the edge of this huge continent with all its resources, and people were pushing out, setting up little communities. And so your constitution doesn't set lots of bureaucratic rules. It defines what sort of society you should be. But there was no way the government could have administrative rules that they could enforce. It couldn't have a minimum wage law in the 1770s and then have enough bureaucracy to enforce it. No, you couldn't do that. So they had to allow people to sort out their own problems as they went along. And they did that. And they did it from Protestant congregations because the Catholic Church, being hierarchical, didn't really fit in America for a couple of centuries almost. Then it could find a niche. But the Anglicans are somewhat the same. They sat on the edge. But it was nonconformists who could handle the situation. And to this day, America is a can-do society, whereas you look at Europe and Britain now, sadly, and when something goes wrong, they wait for the government to do something. And increasingly that's happening in America. whereas they used to do it themselves in the past. That was an amazing thing. De Tocqueville, 100 years before, Chesterton came because he'd watched the American Revolution lead to the growth of an amazing nation, and the French Revolution chopped the heads off all the people who were educated. When they executed Lavoisier, they said, we have no need of chemists. Wow. One of the greatest chemists of all time. They just chopped his head off because he was a member of the aristocracy. That's, cutting off your nose to spite your face, big time. So that is worrying me. But the good bit is the number of highly intelligent people who are beginning to say this again. And those that are not saying it are beginning to be somewhat more, what's the word I want? They're not giving in, they're not giving up, but they're somewhat more respectful, especially when they meet the people who really thought themselves out through the whole situation. I think the best example of this would be John Lennox from Oxford, who has lived a committed Christian life from his student days in Cambridge, where he was given the choice. Either you ditch this Christianity stuff or there's no place for you here. So he didn't stay in Cambridge. He was sent out to, I think he went to Cardiff to do the next bit of his work, but he eventually came back to Oxford, and nobody takes him on easily. In fact, I've never seen anyone take him down in debate. But debates are always in the eye of the beholder to some extent, and I'm certainly on his side. But if you've never watched him, watch him. There's plenty of his stuff on YouTube, and he can move you on. And he doesn't write fancy academic books. He sits down and writes little books that anyone can understand, but are actually extremely erudite, but no pride involved. That's wonderful. So that gives me hope. And then you see people like Neil Ferguson saying we need Christ, Tom Holland on Unheard saying much the same, and also talking to N.T. Wright at some stage on Unbelievable. All around there are signs of life, and I see that in my travels. The last visit to the States, which was the first one for a little while since Canadian Thanksgiving, so it's about 6 months or so, was first to Tulsa in Oklahoma and then to Chicago. And in both cases, I went to interact, talk to people in family medicine residence programs. I've been to In His Image several times over the years, and I have a lot of respect for them. I've also been to what was the Lawndale Clinic, now the Lawndale Christian Health Center in Southside Chicago, the most dangerous part of Chicago. I've been there many times as well. They are just starting a residency program. Where better if you want to do your family practice with the poor, the dispossessed, the underprivileged. You couldn't find a better place than Southside Chicago, and yet see it happen. So what is remarkable about these two clinics is that they are unashamedly Christian. Another great strength of America that you haven't yet come to the point, although there are people amongst the liberal elite who would they would shut these places down if they could. But it doesn't fit with your constitution. I think they'd lose any attempt, and they've certainly thought about it. So they're quite different in that In His Image came from a Pentecostal background some 25 years ago, when Pentecostal-based university failed in Tulsa. The one thing that survived was the family practice program, and its leader for many years, Dr. John Crouch, did an amazing job of getting the Christian community to back them in what they're doing, and it is a pleasure to go there. It's the only residency program I know that has a spiritual retreat every year, And it's also the only family practice program I know where the vast majority of the students who go through that, the residents who go through that program, spend some time in what used to be called the developing world. And the developing bit is not happening, but the materially poor world anyway, and the metaphysically poor world too in many respects. So they have a breadth of understanding which is very good. Now, in particular, multiculturalism has been a disaster for the Western world. They don't buy that. One of the few things I got into some considerable trouble with a few years ago when I wrote a little pamphlet called The Myth of Multicultural Medicine. And the reason I did it is because it seemed to me that what we were doing was intellectually indefensible. A multicultural society is a contradiction in terms. Alan Bloom, the atheist professor of ancient languages at Chicago in the 80s, nailed it beautifully in The Closing of the American Mind, where he gives a definition of community which is central to the practice of medicine. He said he remembers his grandparents going to the synagogue where they heard great scholars who spoke not from an alien perspective, but from the same perspective, while simply going deeper and providing guidance. That, he says, is what a community is, something that invites high and low into a common story of meaning. Multiculturalism has a lie at its heart. It says all cultures are equal. No, they're not. Equal is not a term that you can use there. They're different. And those differences matter. And to the Muslims, they matter more than they do to erstwhile Christians who seem to have forgotten where they come from. But the Muslims show loyalty over truth. Mohammed is alleged to have told them that, look, you can lie to an infidel. You can do anything to an infidel. At the end of the day, they have to convert to Islam. They're not multicultural at all. Mrs. Thatcher rightly refused to go to the opening of a mosque in London with whoever was in charge of Saudi Arabia at the time and said, I will come if you can take me to the opening of a church in Riyadh with the same degree of publicity. That has never happened. And when it does, we'll know the world has changed. But before that, we need to be serious about what we want. And the things we want, of course, the technocratic expertise that came out of the Western world, it's not this stupid zero-something which you hear all the while, people, not their fault, saying from Africa, we're poor because you are rich. You took our wealth away from us. No, not a bit of it. The wealth was there. You didn't know how to use it because you didn't have the history that we had. There are only about half a dozen stories that can make some sense of life. And a life that cannot deal with contemplating death, that doesn't have objective moral truth underlying it so that everybody knows what right and wrong is, like children know until we teach them otherwise, that can deal with suffering and injustice and has an understanding of knowledge and learning, and the outcome of it all is an ethical system that the ordinary people never even think about. I usually say I grew up on a street of 400 houses where we never locked our doors and the police didn't visit, because when people got into confrontation, if somebody says the Bible says, that would finish it. Because up until the relatively recent past, the Bible was taught in school every day that you were in school, which meant that at the end of whatever number of years it was, I mean, it was only about 9 years for many people. You could leave at 15. You heard the Bible read every day at peak memorization time. So it's the only book they know at all well, or did. Now that, of course, has been removed, and it's used occasionally in multicultural sessions so that they can try and preserve the myth that they're all equal, really. They're not. They're different. So the biggest story of all, the one that really takes away the zero-sum approach to wealth around the world, just as an aside, remember that wealth didn't really start accumulating in the way we see it now until really after the Second World War for ordinary people in Europe. I grew up on a family when I was young who lived on about $20 a week. What has happened in my lifetime is an explosion of wealth as we began to understand a bit more about how it worked. I mean, Neil Ferguson's book, it's about money, and I've forgotten the title for the moment. I am of an age when that happens. The Ascent of Money, I think it's called, but you'll find it easily. Neil is spelled Niall, brought up atheist. Just recently has said, I go to church now, we need Christ. But in that book, he certainly convinced me that banking had done a lot of good for us when it was put into the context of a judeo-christian society. Doesn't do so well elsewhere. Ask the people who put their money in the first Russian banks when the wall came down in 1989. Well, the people who founded the banks quickly disappeared with the money. It took Christians 1,000 years to run their own banking system. The Jews had to do it because God had taught them, you must keep your promises about money. And you can't charge your brother and sister very much at all, but you can charge other people, but not more than you agreed to. That's the essence of banking, trust. And trust is going through the system at the moment, and out the bottom end, there's nothing to save it. You ask students, how many people in your class could you trust with a couple of $1,000? And the answer is, I'm not sure. One. That used to be so different. So different. Trust is the issue for the future. And where does trust come from? Well, I don't see that real trust can happen in a society that doesn't have a real sense of judgment. As the psalmist says, in your sight, no one can stand. So we need mercy. My favorite description of what Christianity does in my life is again from the Psalms, and it's just 2 lines. Mercy and truth have met. Righteousness and peace have kissed. You can think about those 2 lines for the rest of your life. That's how valuable they are. And we've lost that transcendent dimension. The young are lost because of it. And when they meet it, and sometimes the first time they meet it, and you can talk to them about it, is precisely when they have their first baby, because most of them are not having babies anymore. So they're missing that moment of civilization. It's very sad. Very, very sad. But you can talk at that moment, because they realize in no time flat that this little bundle of life has total control of them, in the sense of they will do anything to give them a better life, to take care of them. And it gives them more pleasure than almost anything else they've done in their lives. We used to know these things, and now we have lost them. Tulsa started a fairly standard family practice, and they reached out into rural areas with mobile vans that were equipped. John Crouch was a superb fundraiser to make that happen. And as I say, I love going there. There's an atmosphere of trust. And of course, in the modern world, everybody almost that you see in a family practice, certainly in a city, the primary source of their disease is not physical. It's not viruses and bacteria and all those things. It's how they live. They have problems with how they live. Their problem is they lack a moral foundation. There's a lovely line in Dalrymple, who, as far as I know, is not Christian, but he recognizes its strength. And he worked for many years with the poorest of the poor in the poorest part of Birmingham, was a prison psychiatrist. But he gives an account of talking to a man whose wife had a severe case of obsessive compulsive disorder. So getting out of the house was very difficult because she had to keep going back to check that the gas was turned off, etc., etc. And he was talking to this man about how he had devoted his life to getting this woman through life. And Dalrymple said to him, "Didn't you ever consider divorce?" And he said, "No, I know who she really is. Other people don't." That is an extraordinary statement. You look at Islam and how many wives you can have, and you beat your wife if she doesn't do exactly what you want. That's a very different world. And it wasn't that man sought it out. It was that man grew up in a culture where it was sought out. It is extraordinary that Shakespeare's plays were listened to by ordinary people who enjoyed them. They got the jokes, of course, but they also understood what he was talking about. And he could write about all the big issues, which is why we used to go back to him. Now the students don't read Shakespeare. I mean, it's not read to them. It's not explained to them. And the great key that made it possible was there are so many echoes of the Bible, every page. So the people listening had heard those. They had to go to church or they got fined. So they were exposed to great language, beautifully written, and it changed their souls. What repeated stories do we have now? What songs can we all sing? It's amazing, isn't it? That Amazing Grace is one of the few things in America that almost everybody knows some of the words of. You have the sort of national anthem things, which they're not sung with the same passion, are they? These things can happen. I mean, the Welsh rugby team sings in Welsh, "Guide me, O thou great Jehovah," as they open before a game. But it's amusing, but it's also deeply moving. So in Southside, Wayne and Gina were students at Yale, and they thought they wanted to be missionaries, but they would go and help in the Lawndale Clinic for a while. They've been there for 30 plus years now and taken what was just about surviving to a program that I think the number is sees 60,000 patients a year, has reclaimed a considerable area of Southside, where Martin Lloyd-Jones, where now I've got the names mixed up. Martin Luther King lived for a while. His house is still labelled in that area. It's a wonderful place to go and see how they have changed the atmosphere. One of the things they've created is an urban farm, both vegetables and fish, right there in the middle of Southside. The erstwhile last thoughtful mayor of Chicago they had, who was previously Obama's chief of staff, when he visited, he said, "We couldn't do this. We couldn't do this." The liberal elite have no real answers to the question of a society that's fallen apart. Now, there are answers. Tom Sowell, sadly, is hated by many in the black community, particularly the so-called educated blacks, because he's very straightforward about what has gone wrong. The entitled elite replacing a way of life that even the people living in Chicago have largely forgotten. At the beginning of the last century, the likelihood of a black boy having a father at home was slightly higher than for a white guy. And in the early part of the last century, before the stupidity of minimum wage came in, a black boy was more likely to have a job in the summer than a white boy. Tom Sowell will enlighten you on these things if you think what I've just said can't possibly be true. Oh, yes, it's true. I have for many years used Tom Sowell's 3 questions you should ask about social policy. First of all, before you change a policy, sit down and think whether what you're proposing will have attached to it some real problems. Don't ditch the policy that's been in place easily. Then, when you've thought about what the difficulties might be, you will need to produce some data showing that they can be handled. Only when you've gone through that process should you move. I mean, Tom Sowell himself was turned around by realizing that the minimum wage law actually meant that black boys, instead of getting a job which allowed them to get a bicycle or do something, had no job at all because minimum wage was not viable. But when I was a kid and wanted to go cycling all over Europe as a teenager, I needed some money. We didn't have any money in the family for that, so I could go and get a short-term job. I usually went to the same farm because the farmer was nice to me and he knew what I wanted to do and how much I needed, and I worked and I got the money I needed. No, there wasn't any talk about what wage the government dictated. I just wanted money in order to be able to live for a month on the continent, which I did, and saw a lot of it on a bicycle, going into ordinary shops, buying a loaf of German bread, which would last 3 days because it was tough to eat, but it kept us going. That's a different world, lost to us now. And when my generation disappears, even more will be lost. I mean, we're closing classics departments at a rate of knots, so that a Victor Davis Hanson is not likely to reappear. That is sadness of the very highest order. What I saw, as on previous occasions I've seen, but every time it's a little better, is how not only do they provide the basic family practice healthcare, but they're getting them to change the way they eat, the way they exercise, their attitude to drugs, etc., etc., because they have a base for that, which is important. When Obama's erstwhile chief of staff visited, he became friends with the black pastor who was the leader of the pastoral program, now the CEO of the Lawndale Christian Health Clinic. By the way, because of the government's cutting back on money, if you're looking for somewhere to deposit some charitable funds, they would greatly appreciate it at the moment. Those visits to Tulsa and to Chicago reminded me yet again that the thing that keeps us going is not how well we've learned medicine, which you can get from a book increasingly now, except that we're not even sure how much of the data that's being published is reliable, probably less than 40%. I was listening yesterday to Jay Bhattacharya, the new head of NIH, talking to Peter Robinson on his website, Uncommon Knowledge at the Hoover Institute, describing the problem and what he, as the new head of NIH, is trying to do to deconstruct this I scratch your back, you scratch mine corruption of research that has happened. That's probably another talk. But before I do that, the next one will probably be on, because it's been asked for, on the work I did with malnutrition and what we could learn from it today. So go and find out a bit about the Lawndale Clinic. Just look it up on Google and you'll get there. And if you can, support them. But meanwhile, have a great week thinking about what matters most in your life and how you can support it.